Good morning, everyone. As Dr. Hamilton mentioned, my name is Seth Harden. I come from Indiana. I work for the Nature Conservancy. So drove through the back end of the rainstorm yesterday on the way out. It took about 6.5 hours to get out here, but I will say, I was telling Stan earlier that I've never stopped in Iowa. I've always drove through Iowa, but it really is a pretty neat and actually has a lot of beauty to it that a farm boy from Indiana can appreciate. A lot of nice corn rows, some good populations out there, and your corn looks a lot better than ours right now. So it was a good drive, and I'm excited to be here. I'm going to start out with sharing a little bit about, I've traveled to several countries around the world. I've seen the Sydney Opera House, I've seen the Eiffel Tower, I've seen Colombia, I've seen the rainforest in Colombia, I've seen places like that. And you may be asking, why am I starting my presentation by telling you about my travels? It's not to brag, it's merely to say that I've been blessed with those opportunities. But the most important thing to come out of that is that still my favorite place on earth is my grandparents' farm. So I will be the 7th generation on my grandparents' farm. My grandfather was the last to farm it since he switched over to a different full-time position. He has cash rented the farm out, but it's still my favorite 180 acres in the entire universe is the farm on Buck Creek in eastern Indiana. So that's my tie to agriculture, and that's really how I got my start in conservation. Is I have my roots in agriculture, but I grew up paddling the streams of Indiana, hiking different places across the country, and that really brings me to where I pull together my interests and passions of agriculture and conservation. I got a degree in forestry from Purdue in 2010, and that served me really well. Purdue University obviously has a good reputation, and it really set me up for what I've done so far. Like Stan, I've also worked for NRCS for a couple of years, and I've had a couple of conversations about that, and there is a lot of opportunity to work with NRCS, but also a lot of opportunity to improve on some of the things they've accomplished to date. I've also worked in the policy realm. I spent a couple years working for Indiana Farm Bureau, and so after working under the Farm Bill, I thought it would be fun to work on the Farm Bill, so spent some time doing that as well. So enough about me. I am here to talk about working with non-operator landowners, and I really want this presentation to be engaging for you. I'm not here to lecture to you. I didn't come all the way from Indiana just to talk. I want to hear from you as well, and this will help inform some of the research we are doing at TNC. So I'm going to start by asking a few questions of all of you. First, let me ask this: how many folks in here are landowners? All right, several. All right, how many of those farm that acreage? Okay, so one out of 5 or 6, 7. So that's going to play perfectly into what I'm going to ask you here. So the first question I have is, what are, for those of you that are landowners, and this should be interesting to the rest of the people in the room, what are your main goals you have for your land? Just toss them out there. I'm going to write them right here to keep track of them. So I know the one that farms probably dollars, income, right? Okay. Others? Okay. Others? I'm glad to hear those two early. That's, for folks at a conference like this, it's good to hear conservation and stewardship. Any other goals? Do you like seeing deer on your property? Do you like
a place to retreat to?
Okay. All right. Retreat. Good.
Something to pass on.
Okay. So a legacy of sorts? All right. So that gives us a little bit of a start, and we'll get back to these here in a minute. So what challenges are you and your tenant, if you own agricultural land, facing on your land? What are the things that you talk to your tenant farmer about when you reset your lease every year? What are the issues that you see as an owner that maybe the farmer doesn't know about? And what are the things that the farmer complains about to you?
Input costs.
Okay. All right. Others? So you're telling me that your relationship with your landowner or farmer is perfect. It's all roses and rainbows. There's never any complaints. There's never any tension. It's just completely perfect. You wouldn't change anything about it.
Well, there's another option. They're not talking about it.
All right. That's very true. Very true. So maybe there's that lack of communication. So other challenges. Yeah.
We decided to put in some, about 6.5 acres of pollinator.
Okay.
So we're going down that road. It's a new challenge.
Sure. So I guess different objectives maybe between the owner and the farmer in certain ways. In the back.
Being a good neighbor in a competitive environment.
Okay. All right, good. And the last one, and from what I've heard so far, hopefully there's some good answers to this. What are you doing now to invest in soil health? Okay. Very good.
Cover crops.
Okay. Anybody have tile in their fields?
Only if you want to grow something.
Yeah. Does anybody manage that water in the tile? Is there any drainage water management here in Iowa?
You know what there is.
Okay. Okay. All right. Other investments in soil health.
Doesn't habitat.
Okay. So different types of cover. Others?
Soil sampling and tile monitoring.
Very good. So monitoring, like Stan was talking about, making sure you know what's happening out there, right? Very good. So the rest of my discussion today is really going to focus on non-operator landowners. So again, the majority of the landowners in this room are non-operators. They do not actively farm the land. Some non-operator landowners have farmed in the past. They have history doing that, and some do not. And so obviously there would be a knowledge and learning curve for those folks that maybe don't have experience in agriculture. But those that do may be either a pest to their farmer or they may be an ally in a lot of ways as well. So here is a definition of non-operator landowner as we're using it in our research. So a non-operator landowner owns and rents out agricultural land but is not actively involved in farming, just as I said. So here are some statistics for Iowa. The number of non-operator landowners is almost 43,000. 86% of them live in-state. 14% live out of state. The average number of acres controlled by a non-operator landowner is 514, which is quite a bit larger than what happens in Illinois and Indiana, our other two research states. The average age is 64, which is pretty consistent across our research area in those three states. And as you can see here, there's a lot of speculation that females control a lot of that acreage, but actually statistics say that it's still a male-dominated space as landowners. And as you can see here, we did break out couples because there is a lot of joint decision-making on that as well. So those are some of the statistics according to NASS and ARS. So let's take a poll of this room and find out what we have here. Let's run through this again. All right, raise your hand if you're a landowner, just a landowner. All right, so keep your hand up if you're a non-operator landowner. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right. And then we had one that farms. Very good. All right, so we're going to get a little into the weeds here. So of those folks that are non-operator landowner or that are, non-operator landowners, how many do a straight cash rent? It's money and you don't pay any extra attention to it. Raise your hand. All right, 3. So if I do my math right, that means that there are 3 that use some other sort of lease, which we may talk about here in a minute. Okay, so out of those non-operator landowners, raise your hand if you use an annual lease. Every year you renegotiate somehow, you chat about it over a picnic table, you go into the attorney, whichever. All right. So I see 2, right? So everybody else that's not that as a landowner, you negotiate a longer period of time than just 1 year. Okay.
Why don't you ask people to raise their hands again on that? I'll let you count it.
Sure. Lease length, annual. Every single year you talk it over with your tenant farmer.
Well,
All right.
talk, but don't necessarily change the payment.
But the lease is a 1-year lease, right? Is it an
So you have an opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you have an opportunity at 1 year. You could say that farmer A, you're not the farmer anymore. You could switch out. Okay, so you would be in that category as well. Right, and that's really interesting that comes up because that's a social dynamic that we've discovered. I think it's something that people have really had some thoughts about for a long time, but that the legal process is an annual thing, but the trust factor and the relationship with the farmer is often decades, right? And so it's really interesting how the farmer handles that risk or understands that risk that way. So we'll leave that as it is, and we can revisit that as well. So of those folks that are non-operator landowners, how many have conservation of some sort written into their lease? However you define it. Conservation, so no-till, cover crop, something like that where you obligate the farmer to do something, or at least put language in there that indicates that. All right, so we've got 3. So we will we'll get back to that here in a minute, but I think that's really interesting to kind of capture that to start with. So a lot of these have been mentioned already, so I'm not going to labor this too much, but for soil health, here's a little bit of the case that we're sharing with folks that we're working with in our research. The first is soil health, is reduced erosion and soil loss. And this is all peer-reviewed science, and so all of the claims here are backed up by university research coming out of Iowa State, Purdue, Illinois, those kind of universities. So direct comparisons of soil erosion under conventional no-till methods show that no-till practices can reduce soil erosion up to 1,000 times more effectively, which I think would support a lot of the things that Stan was sharing. A cover crop containing legumes, so if you don't know what that is, they fix nitrogen, and or brassicas, so terms and radishes, which really break up that soil structure and increase infiltration. Can follow crops such as corn and wheat and to help those residues decompose and allow nutrients to become more available for the next crop. And so one thing that a lot of folks ask about is, great, we're doing cover crops, but when are those nutrients released? When can they be used by the crop? Because they're only doing farmer good if they're able to release that nitrogen at the right time. Farm resilience with weather variability. Again, this was discussed earlier this morning, is the weather is changing. Some folks call it climate change. Some people call it weather variability. Some people call it it's just a cycle. It'll in 10 years we'll be back to normal again. If you increase the water holding capacity of your soil organic matter, you can decrease that variability by 20%. Again, supported by many of our speakers this morning is the fact that yield variability is very much reduced when you naturalize the processes on the soil. And last, improved water utilization and management. Available water capacity can more than double when soil organic matter increases. So increasing that soil organic matter, like they were mentioned this morning, really allows you to hold that water and lets you be more resilient when conditions are a bit tough. Cover crop benefits. So in our research, we had the whole suite of soil health practices to kind of choose from. Cover crops was one that stuck out. It has an accelerating rate of being adopted across the I-states. Indiana itself, so where I'm from, is the number 2 cover crop planting state in the nation, behind Texas. Texas plants a lot of cover crops, they graze a lot of cover crops. So in Indiana, we planted over 1 million acres worth of cover crops for the last 2 years, and so we see that as we see ourselves as a little bit of a model that we hope to share with others. But we also continue, as this research is directed, is to try to expand how we're influencing folks and working with people. So here are some of the benefits that may be of interest to some of you. Suppression of weeds. So as I'll share here in a minute, some of our results show that landowners really like to have their farm or their property looking nice and clean. And I would say that it's considered part of stewardship to some folks. Cover crops recycle nutrients, as I mentioned before. So not just your nitrogen, phosphorus, but also many other micronutrients. Protect water quality. So my position as the Upper Wabash River Director is my main concern is water quality. I work on our freshwater team, and cover crops can aid in reducing loading to streams and water bodies. And lastly, enhancing wildlife habitat. So here, a retreat and conservation is, I would go ahead and assume that wildlife is probably a part of that. And that's a really great way to see your land. And that is a benefit that many folks don't really think about when they think about cover crops. So the Nature Conservancy has taken on thinking about soil health and how we approach it. And this is really blurry from back where you're at, so I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis of it. We've divided, this is our strategy, and we divide it into 3 parts. Science and research, so much what we're doing is gathering that data, learning from all of you, and understanding what is happening on the land. Economic, so this here is talking about landowners and figuring out what the dynamics that are market-based can we influence or not influence, and how can we use those to leverage soil health across the landscape. And once we have that science and understand those market triggers, we potentially can affect policy. So that may influence NRCS procedures. It may influence some of the policies at the state or federal level. So as I've said before, many of these policies and procedures are very much focused on the farmer. Many NRCS programs, the outreach, the PR, and even state programs and local programs are very much focused on working with farmers, which is not a bad thing. But the reason that we see another audience, landowners, as an opportunity is this right here. So of the 913 million farmland acres across the U.S., non-operator landowners control 283 million acres. That's 31% of total farmland in the country is controlled by non-operator landowners. That's equivalent to 8 Iowas. So if you think about conservation on that much space, what kind of impact that could have on, say, the Gulf hypoxia zone or other water bodies or things like that. That's an impressive opportunity for us to take on. So as I've mentioned a couple times, the Nature Conservancy, Sheila Reddy, who is a behavioral economist in our chief scientist office, is the primary investigator on our research. And she has pulled myself in and several others to try to pull together what is happening actually in the field. She wants to understand what it looks like on a practical basis. So here are the objectives of the research we are doing. What are the barriers to conservation on rented land and landowner operator decision making? and what is the effectiveness of interventions in promoting conservation practice on rented land. So this is what it looks like, and I'll go through this real quick. First is understanding decisions and barriers, so talking to landowners and finding out what may be their barriers to influencing conservation on their property, as well as farmers to understand why they may not be adopting conservation on certain property. Baseline assessment and test messages, so we'll be sharing messages back out to those landowners, implementing a trial program, which I'll share here in a minute, and informing practice and policy. So from our qualitative research, so a postdoctoral student at Purdue drove here to Iowa, and actually most of our qualitative research was focused here in Iowa and Western Illinois. Here are some of the decisions and barriers that were identified. So the headings here: information deficit, motivations and incentives, lease terms, cultural interpersonal, and rental market. So if you look at if you look at all these, the ones that have asterisks beside them are the ones that we feel as a nonprofit organization working in conservation that we may have some opportunity to influence. The rental market works on its own. It's it fluctuates a little bit behind commodity prices and up and down, and it depends on land value as well. That's not something that we have an opportunity to affect directly. As we're looking at information deficit, some of that was economic, some operational and agronomic assistance as well. So many landowners and even farmers didn't understand what financial incentives were available, what technical assistance was available, rights and obligations, and many other things. Motivations and incentives. So here's probably the most impactful thing we've learned so far is, and it goes back to our discussion a second ago, is farmers, many of them understand the benefits of some of these practices, but they are unwilling to take on the investment because they are unsure of how long they'll be on that land. And as you said, is you talk about your lease annually, but maybe you've had the same farmer for decades, right? And that's the case across the board, but that farmer still has to assess that risk on an annual basis, and the loss they stand to have if for some reason that were to change is too high for them to take on a cost of conservation practices like these.
We have about 10 minutes left.
Sure thing.
I want to make sure we leave time for questions.
We're getting there. So that's something that we've discovered that we hope to delve into a little bit more. Lease terms. I'll talk about that here in a second. Cultural interpersonal. So many landowners rely on their farmer to make decisions on the land because they're professionals when it comes to farming, which makes a lot of sense. But there's lots of opportunities for a landowner to work that way as well. Aesthetics, again, I mentioned having the roadsides mowed and things like that, and deference to tenants, like I said before. So with all of that in mind, are there any, before we go on and we can integrate this in a little bit into questions, are there any of these that really resonate with any of the landowners in the room that you see as barriers to conservation on your land? Yeah.
I've heard reports from the field that a number of farm operators have to wait months to get technical assistance from NRCS, and that some field offices refuse to provide planning assistance to non-operator landowners. And so I would just point out that if you don't get a professional assessment of what your situation is, how do we expect people to deal with all the other complexities that follow in decision making?
Sure. So that's inconsistency across assistance. Yeah.
Well, and our experience has been that they are reactive. They will come if you ask, but they don't just show up.
Sure. that's an important thing to consider as we talk about some of the solutions on the next slide. Others that stick out to folks that say, yep, that's what's happening in my situation. All right, we'll move on to the potential solutions. So here are some of the things that we're working with in our trial program. So messaging, so sharing with landowners and farmers, like any other organization, is figuring out the best way to communicate what we want people to know. Soil health benefit information, I shared a little bit of that with you, doing that in more dynamic ways so folks can understand. Financial incentives, so as you mentioned, NRCS is one opportunity for financial assistance. There are state programs, local programs as well. And so, but many of those are focused on the farmer. So what if we incentivized a landowner with a per acre amount and asked them to either share that with their farmer, cut the cost on their lease, whatever it may be. What if we change that financial incentive to the landowner as well, rather than the farmer? So that's a pretty interesting one we've got onto so far. Lease addendum. So those of you that mentioned conservation releases, that's good to hear. We have developed a lease addendum that it's not a new lease. It is essentially language to stick into a lease that will put in cover crops, amount of acreage of cover crops, and how that cost will be shared or not shared. A discussion guide, so we're working on that as well. So maybe some of these discussions are really hard to have that way. And sharing testimonials. We've found out that landowners and farmers have had success with these conservation practices. Sharing their story and what their successes are has been an effective way to reach landowners. So lastly, our expected impact is to assist you as landowners and provide these things, ultimately soil health, crop productivity for not only you but also the farmer, resilience in weather variability, and of course maintaining land values. So here are some of our supporters. The research group is across the bottom, so folks from across several states, several organizations. If you have any questions on research or opportunities or some of the things that I've shared maybe as solutions, feel free to contact me or email farmland@tnc.org. And I will do my best to answer questions. So if anybody has, yeah.
So I work with Women, Food, and Agriculture, and we do meetings all over the Midwest
Sure.
with women, mostly non-operator landowners. And our challenge right now, we're actually in urban areas right now, trying to reach out to the non-operator landowners. Our big challenge always is to get the people there.
Right.
Once we have them in the room, we make a big impact. But engaging those people to come, what's a hook that you would suggest to, we appeal to their emotions, we appeal to their interest in, aesthetic legacies, but how do you get them there in a busy world?
Yeah, I think honestly you've hit on some of the most important ones. I think one that I've heard of recently is, using the pollinator movement to draw folks in, because, and not to stereotype, but a lot of times there's interest in gardening or flowers or something of that sort. That's a way to pull folks in, and that's not always true, but that's one good way.
When we do that, we're looking to impact the most agriculture acres as possible. So when we use that hook, we get the backyard gardeners and
Sure.
we get the hobby farmers.
Sure.
We need the big acreage, and
Sure.
that's what we try to target. We gotta get them in.
Sure, absolutely. I completely agree. I think there's kind of shaking the bushes and find those grassroots groups. So whether it's extension, is it soil and water, all the ones that you've probably already reached out to, even civic groups is a great way to start. So, other questions?
Time for another question? Was one that?
Yeah.
It's kind of a similar question, but
Sure.
yeah, the thing I feel like we're having difficulty with is, you can put an article in Wallace's Farmer about cover crops, but that's not a publication that a landowner might read. How do you just reach them and give them these messages?
Yeah, so that's a challenge that we're facing as well, is just identifying landowners, right? That's all government. I mean, the farms are all in a government system, but that's not always the easiest to get that information correct. So learning about local groups that it's just it's been the toughest part of all this research is finding that information. So really don't have a great answer for you there. So yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, I come at things from a contractual standpoint often, so can you talk about being more aggressive about this is the way the contracts are? They include conservation. If you want to start subtracting things rather than the other way, start adding them. Have you done any work with being more aggressive with managers about this is the way we think a template for a conservation contract or a land contract should be developed?
And so when you say manager, you mean like a farm management company?
Maybe.
Okay. So we have actually, one of our focus groups was farm managers. They saw a few opportunities in what we're doing, but also a lot of challenges. But I think you have to enable those landowners to be able to talk to their farm manager. Remember, the farmland owner is the one that ultimately has control, right? It's their asset; they own the land. So, educating them through some of the groups that have been mentioned here is a good way to start. So.
We're at 5 after, so we have to stop. Seth will be repeating it again later this afternoon. Let's thank you. We have 5 minutes to move to your next session.